Got
Are we live now?
it. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this IranWire live event. And I'm sorry for a slight delay. We were just sorting out some technical issues, as usual, in these virtual events. But this is going to be a very interesting and intriguing conversation with two extraordinary individuals. We have Simin Fahandej, who is representative of Baha'i International Community in Geneva. And we have Monir Khanjani, who is joining us from Maryland, I think a suburb of Washington, D.C. Is that right? All right. So I just want to get one of the questions that many people have been asking me out of the way first. And that is, many people know that I'm quite passionate about the issues of religious minorities, especially the rights of Baha'is in Iran. And they tell me that, why do you keep on criticizing the Iranian government? The actions that you're attributing to Iranian government, these happened about 4 decades ago, around 1979, the time of the revolution, and a little bit after that. But that was during the revolutionary fervor, and they haven't done something like that, those kind of atrocious acts since then. So, Simin, I want to ask you, has the confiscation of properties of the Baha'i individuals that happened in the beginning of the revolution stopped after, let's say, mid-80s, or it has been continuing for the past 4 decades?
Thank you, Maziar John, for having me on this panel. It's an honor. And hello to everybody who's joined us during this webinar. So the confiscation of Baha'i properties has been one of the main features of the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, which has not stopped at all in the past couple of decades, and has actually increased. And in fact, over the past year and a half, we've seen that one of the main areas of persecution that has increased the most over the past year and a half has been the confiscation of Baha'i properties in Iran. And unfortunately, one of the newer trends that we've seen in the confiscation is the use, or actually the misuse, of Article 49 of the Iranian Constitution and the legal mechanisms in Iran in general.
Remind us, what is that Article 49? Many people.
Yeah, so Sure, yes, thank you. Article 49 of the Iranian Constitution essentially allows the Iranian government to confiscate any properties that it deems inappropriate under Islamic law. And if you're going to interpret what that means, it can essentially be anything. Anything can be interpreted to be not under Islamic law. Which means basically any Baha'i properties in Iran. And so we've seen, for example, in the village of Ivel, we saw last year that after many, many years of the Baha'is, they're fighting for their properties, which they've had for generations, farms and lands, which they've had for generations, was confiscated and handed over to Setad, which is a parastatal body under the highest leadership of the Iranian government. It's called Setad. Sorry, in English is the execution of Imam Khomeini's order, which is controlled by the highest leadership of the Iranian government. And so the court ruled that all of these properties was to be handed over to ICO or Setad. And this has been actually a trend where in the past year and a half, many properties, Baha'i properties, have been confiscated and handed over to Setad.
And I guess we have to remind the viewers that Setad, or Imam Khomeini's executive office, is not only in charge of Baha'i confiscated properties, but all the confiscated properties from some of the former officials of the previous regimes and many other opposition groups. And I have to make a personal comment here as well, that my apartment in Tehran is also in the hands of the Setad now. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, sorry to hear that. Yeah, and actually, exactly as you said, Setat controls extensive assets in Iran. And so through the confiscation of these properties, is essentially enriching itself and impoverishing Baha'is and others.
Munir, what can you tell us about the confiscation of properties? I know that some of your family members are still in Iran, and you know of certain people whose properties were confiscated. Could you tell us about what you know about the confiscations and especially properties of your family members?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show and having the opportunity to speak up on this matter. While we are, I don't have the more official information. I can bring only my personal family story and share that. So, in the beginning, you mentioned about the initial, in the beginning of the revolution, and how that was the initial attack, and things had not been as bad. And as Ms. Simin said, it has continued. So for my own family personally, the latest massive attack was on 2013, year of 2013, where they attacked our family, 150-year family property, which it's a farm, orchards and cattle. And it not only provides support and livelihood for Baha'i families, it had employed 80 other non-Baha'i families. So these families with one of the best apple orchards, almond orchards, and so it got under attack and demolished and destroyed.
And where was it?
So this is Semnan. We call it Dozgare. That's our villa, which is about I think 40 miles north of Semnan. Again, I've been there
Semnan
as a child.
province.
Yes, Semnan province. And again, my family takes big pride in it. And in addition to our family, with the neighbors, they've always gotten along. And in order to develop this land, my family developed this company, worked with the neighbors, went through proper official governmental procedures to get the right license and certification to build 3 dams in order to get the water supply, build the water supply and electric outlet. And they also built a little small building as well to help supply all this business and development that again went back to the locals. Nobody got rich from it. And in 2013, it came under attack by revolutionary guards in Semnan province. And they declared it a military zone. Now,
and what was the reason? What was the legal justification for confiscation of that property? Because they usually, even though their actions can be illegal, they have some sort of legal justification. What was the legal justification for that?
It was declared an area of military zone. Suddenly, it was, and it was confiscated, the fields and gardens and properties, 2 of the dams destroyed. And the wells were filled with dirt so that it could dry up. Again, I believe I'm here to share personal stories. So one of my aunts who she passed away last year, she Ame Mariam, she in her late 80s. Semnan is her home. She has 9 children, and going to Yelak in province of Semnan and spending half the year there with farming and milking the cow and doing all of this. This was her home in the summers. And this old woman, and she has illnesses, is sick. In the middle of the night, she hears something and wakes up and looks out her little window, and the fields are in fire. She sees just like ammunitions and fire, and the night is becoming light because of the ammunitions and as they're destroying. This is the experience of this woman who hasn't harmed anyone, brought amazing 9 fruitful children that have served the society and are exemplars in their community. And this is what she experienced.
And
I
she
can't
had received
imagine.
no warning before that. They had not told her that this is going to be a military zone and we need you to evacuate this area.
No.
Nothing.
So
And
for
was your family compensated? Because in these cases, in the cases that the government is going to build a highway or a military facility or whatever, they compensate the residents, maybe not at the market price. Was your family compensated at all for the confiscation of the property? Not at all.
Not at all. And from my knowledge, next several years, the family tried to go through the legal and has had 2 cases, actually active cases, which has not been responded to, has been ignored fully. But one, I know that international attention and these conversations does help, because the locals, or not local people, but even the military guards, they believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're serving their country and their religion. So by them hearing these conversations, and I'm so grateful to IranWire and these conversations, I think it kind of helps opens their mind and understand what's going on, the human factor of it, as opposed to brainwashing or this propaganda that has nothing to do with.
Thanks very much, Munir. I think there is a lot to unpack here, but let's go through them one by one. Simin, I want to ask you about the history of these confiscations, because when we talk about the Baha'is and the rights of minorities in Iran, many people just think about the past 4 decades and the period after the Iranian Revolution, and they say that everything before the revolution was hunky-dory and there was no problems. Could you, I know that you are going to show us some photos of the pre-revolution era. Could you tell us about the history of suppression of the Baha'is in Iran and also specifically attacks against their lands and confiscations?
Thank you. Sorry, do you mean just in general since the inception of the Baha'i faith, or post the revolution?
Maybe a little bit more recent, maybe in the 20th
Okay.
century, especially after the 1953 and the attack against the Baha'i shrine in Tehran.
Yeah, so of course, the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran is not new. As you mentioned, it's been a long-standing thing. Even before the revolution, we had also some confiscation of Baha'i properties, Baha'i Center, for example. So it's not new. However, what changed after the Iranian Revolution is that the persecution became systematic and it became government policy, whereas before it was certain elements within the government. There was a lot of, for example, clergy that were behind the persecution. But then once the revolution happened, it really became part of the Iranian government's policy to persecute the Baha'is in an official manner. And we saw this, of course, many of us know about the 1991 document, which was signed and approved by the supreme leader and Iran's president at the time, to essentially calling on all government agencies to block the progress of the Baha'i community in Iran. So it is not new, but it became systematic. I think I would categorize the confiscation of Baha'i properties in Iran under 4 categories. One has been Baha'i holy places. Another has been Baha'i cemeteries. The third one has been Baha'i institutionally owned properties. And the fourth has been individual properties belonging to Baha'is. So they're not institutional, but they're owned by Baha'is, and they're being persecuted because of their individual beliefs in the Baha'i faith.
Are you saying that all those 4 different categories were attacked and confiscated before the revolution as well, or just after the revolution?
A little bit, but not at all to the extent that we saw after the revolution.
It wasn't
The
as
extent,
systematic and state-backed as it's been after the revolution. It was maybe
exactly.
sporadic and people took actions, vigilantes took actions, but it wasn't as systematic. Okay.
It wasn't as systematic. It was sporadic, as you said. It was done by certain elements of the government. It was done sometimes by individuals, even at their own accord. But after the revolution, even the number increased tremendously after the revolution.
Actually, I'd like to talk about the role of individuals a bit later, but go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, yes. And that's been another thing that we've also spoken about for sure. So, I mean, I think many people probably are familiar somewhat with the history of the confiscation of Baha'i property. I mean, I can show some of the photos here. I will just,
I think you can share your screen.
yes, I will just. Okay, here we go. Are you able to see this?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great.
If you don't mind, make the photos, yeah, full screen. So,
Yes,
so what are we
absolutely.
looking at here now?
So, I mean, this is just a general, you see the confiscation of properties. We saw that after the revolution, one of the very first Baha'i holy places, this is an example of one of the holy places that was confiscated and destroyed, was the House of the Bab in Shiraz. Of course, the Bab, as many know, is one of the prophet founders of the Baha'i faith. And this house, this is the original house before destruction, has a very, very special significance in the Baha'i faith and has a very special place for many Baha'is. And so this was one of the very first holy places that was destroyed. You'll see here the destruction, the process of the destruction that took place. And actually, in place of House of the Bab, in Shiraz, now there has been built a mosque and Islamic centers, which
So
again,
the revolution happened in February 1979. When did this destruction happen?
this happened very shortly after, in 1979.
In
So
1979.
yes, in 1979. And
Do
here,
you know who carried it out?
so it was very much government sponsored, and actually we've seen in the destruction of many of the Baha'i holy places that there were present, some of the government officials were actually present there, showing kind of the government sponsorship of the destruction of Baha'i holy places. And here, a Baha'i who was actually executed in Iran that filmed part of the destruction. I mean, he was kind of hidden, so that's why the quality isn't very good and it's zooming in and out. But the person who filmed this was actually executed himself. It's a very short video, so I will just play it here.
Sure. And who was that person?
Kurosh was his name.
And what was the reason for his execution?
Because of his belief in the Baha'i faith. Him, along with many others in Shiraz and across Iran, over 200 Baha'is were executed in Iran after the revolution for their beliefs in the Baha'i faith. Many, I mean, hundreds more were arrested, tortured, and over 200 were executed. So you'll see here that the House of the Bab is being destroyed.
Yeah.
There are actually several other videos of the destruction.
Of the
And this
same
is
period. And who owned that property before the revolution?
it's a Baha'i-owned property.
Yeah,
So
but was it owned by an individual or was it owned by an organization? What's the legal status?
it was, I mean, it's owned, I mean, officially by the Baha'i community, so Baha'i funds.
All right, Baha'i funds. Okay.
So
And we know that taking over a property illegally in Islam is a sin. And what is the religious, and after the revolution, of course, the theology of Islam became part of the Iranian law. Islamic law basically became Iranian law. What was the religious reason for taking over that property and destroying it?
You
if
see,
there was any religious reasons given.
yeah, so I think it goes back to the entire reason for the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran. I think there has been an issue with the Baha'i faith in Iran because it's a religion that came after Islam. And so while the Baha'i faith recognizes and respects Islam as a religion, and of course other religions as well, as faiths, and it believes that religions essentially are part of one truth. In Iran, the Baha'i faith was not recognized as a religion because it came after Islam. And so Baha'is have been seen as infidels, they have been seen as apostates, they have been seen as unclean, najis, it's called in Persian. And so the entire religious reasoning, as you mentioned, is because essentially of their belief in the Baha'i faith. And we saw, for example, in the early years of the revolution, many Baha'is who were arrested, they were told, Ya Islam, Ya Idam. So either choose Islam or be executed.
Executed.
Which essentially shows that the entire reasoning behind their persecution and arrest in the first place was their belief in the Baha'i faith.
So based on that concept of Baha'is being unclean and infidels, according to some Muslim scholars and to some Iranian Muslim scholars, individuals have to take actions against infidels as well. And in my interviews with different Baha'i individuals whose properties were confiscated, they said that the government or government agencies did not have to do anything with the confiscation of their properties in the beginning. But it was their neighbors, it was the people they had lived with for a long, long time that took over the properties. Could you tell us about the role of individuals and not the government or government agencies in this confiscation of lands or attacks against the individual Baha'is?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Actually, the BIC has a publication called Violence with Impunity, which essentially deals with this question of the acts of violence and aggression that have happened against the Baha'is in Iran with complete impunity. And of course, as mentioned, it has been government sponsored, but it would be interesting to really look at and research the impact of laws on people's behaviors on the ground. And so this document actually looks at how the Iranian government's persecution of the Baha'is has impacted also individuals and has given them the permission to act violently with impunity. We even saw some years ago a Baha'i was shot dead by an individual and was actually never really given any sentence, despite the fact that it was proven that it was an intentional murder. And absolutely, in terms of confiscation and destruction of properties, it's been the same thing with cemeteries, individual properties. I mean, the graffiti we see on the walls, Baha'i properties, is done by, many times has been done by individuals, and the vandalism and even cars, as properties. But I think what I'd like to emphasize here is that although individuals have had a role in the persecution of the Baha'is over the past 40 years, the attitude towards the Baha'is by individuals, Iranians, has shifted so drastically over the past recent years, I would say. And so, yes, of course, there would still be people who believe in the anti-Baha'i propaganda that the Iranian government kind of puts out there, and the impunity that they would gain from acting violently towards the Baha'is. But many, many, many more Iranians are actually supportive of the Baha'is and actually apologize individually to Baha'is, even though
I noticed that as well, that more Iranians are more sympathetic to what has happened to the Baha'is in the past 4 decades. Munir, in your conversations with your aunt and other members of your family, did they talk about a neighbor, an individual they knew for a long time, a friend or former friend who took part in these attacks and confiscations?
That I have not heard of, but I've heard opposite in the case of my family. Again, I don't necessarily am privy to all the information either, having living here. However, as far as I know, the neighbors and the people who live in the same street have been supportive and helpful during the vandalism or during the arson incidents. Even this goes back early in the revolution in 79, 80. My dad is an optician. He just passed away this month. But anyways, he had two big showrooms in one of the main streets in Isfahan. And early on, again, there was vandalism by people in street clothes. So we don't know who they were. However, they threw homemade bombs into the store, and the fire department did not respond. So as people we were calling, we didn't get any help from the fire department. And the neighbors actually helped my dad and the employees to sustain the fire.
And one of your family members, Mr. Khanjani, spent 10 years in prison, I believe, because he was one of the Yaran, one of the, I don't think that you call them leaders of the Baha'i community, but the people who are part of the administration of the Baha'is in Iran. What did he tell you about his interrogations and his, the way that he was treated in prison?
So it's interesting. Since his release, I had the pleasure of visiting with him briefly in Istanbul, and he would not talk about any details to at least the family members. But what he said was he was very humble, and he said he's always had the posture of service to humanity and understanding, love, compassion. Though he's a very smart businessman and brought the first brick factory to Iran and employed thousands of people and their families. So he wouldn't say much. He said it's an honor, and anything he can do to support humanity, he would do. That's what he has said. I have heard more from some of his prison mates or people who were with him and then they got released, who weren't necessarily Baha'i either. About the inhumane way of treating him, and him being the more leader figure of the Yaran, how they would try to humiliate him in front of the Yaran to break their spirits or his spirit.
By insulting him as a Baha'i.
Yes, physically and emotionally. And and he would say, I am their leader. Leave them, the other six alone. You're dealing with me. So he really tried to step up that way. I hear his spirit was amazing. He was such an inspiration, even in prison, to people. Again, not from him directly, but from others. That even when he went to Rajai Shahr, once he was sentenced for 20 years, that he as he befriended eventually some of the inmates, they told him that. They told us you guys were coming, the guards, and said, and we were encouraged to hurt you. And if we do anything to you, they will look the other way. And some said we could even be rewarded. However,
the authorities had asked some prisoners to hurt the Baha'i prisoners inside the Raja Shah prison.
And it's interesting how once they got to know them, because they lived together, confined 24/7, they would sit around, talk, ask, talk about their problems, why they're there. Even when early on, when my uncle got very ill, you have ration amount of medicine or tea, but they would even bring their Tylenol or medicine to him so he could feel better. So it's amazing how, despite all this propaganda and attempt of raising hate among people, once people are connecting with the Baha'is and are actually communicating, those barriers breaks, and there's just this kind and loving communication.
Well, I think that's true about every human being.
Absolutely.
That if you don't know them, that it's easier to hate them. And I'm sure many people who hate Jews or Muslims or Christians, they've never met a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian in their lives. And when they get to know them, they have a different experience. And in this case, it's true as well. So Simin, I want to ask you about the consistency of confiscations and pressure on the Baha'i community in the past 40 years. Has it been consistent since 1979, or it has ebbed and flowed, that sometimes there's been periods that there was no confiscation and then it intensified? How was it? How's it been in the past 4 decades?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's been very consistent, and there has always been some type of a confiscation of property, whether it was holy places or individual properties or cemetery destructions. That aspect of the persecution has been consistent. And actually, another aspect of these confiscation has been the very high bails that are asked of Baha'is, sometimes in the form of properties, in order to release them from prison, and then sometimes they spend essentially years waiting for their imprisonment, which is another form of persecution. It's a psychological form of persecution when you and your family are constantly waiting to be imprisoned. On top of that, your property has been taken away from you, and so it's been a consistent feature of the persecution. And one thing I wanted to say is that this aspect of the confiscation and destruction of Baha'i properties is actually an effort to completely destroy the Baha'i community from the history of Iran. Because if you look at holy places and cemeteries, they're the cultural heritage of a community, sometimes even considered the religious heritage of a community. And so destroying them and building other things on top of them, Islamic holy sites or Islamic sites, for example, is an effort to destroy the Baha'i faith from the history of Iran, which we've seen, for example, in removing them from history books and things like that as well, has been part of the same efforts.
And apparently the Iranian government has even persuaded its allies in Iraq to destroy some Baha'i holy places as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so there was, of course, there's a Baha'i holy place also in Baghdad, in Iraq, which some years ago also was targeted. Of course, Iran is behind many other persecution of the Baha'is. I mean, we know, for example, Yemen as well, the persecution of the Baha'is in Yemen is also
So I just want to unpack the legal aspects, if you don't mind. So you are a Baha'i in a village in Iran, and you move out because of persecution, and then an individual, a neighbor, or someone in the village is taking over your property. What happens then? Who owns that property? How legal is that confiscation and takeover of that property according to the Iranian law? What happens to that property?
Sorry, were you asking me that question?
Yes, I'm asking you the question, Simin, that what happens to the confiscation when an individual out of his own, accord, take over a Baha'i property in a village or somewhere in Iran? How that person is then going to justify that legally?
You mean just a person who's not a Baha'i confiscating?
Yes. So I have to give you the exact examples that I've heard, that some Baha'is in the village of Evil in Mazandaran, after the persecution in the beginning of the revolution, they moved out of their village. Their houses were empty, and people in the village took over those houses after they were evacuated by the Baha'is. What is the legal status of those properties, confiscated properties, not by the government, but by individuals?
So in the case of Ivel, the properties that were taken over by individuals or by the government were all confiscated, essentially, because if you are in a court with a Baha'i, it's, because of their belief in the Baha'i faith, you can justify whatever you have done to them, right? We know that even in the case of Qasas, for example, a Baha'i, killing a Baha'i is not the same as not killing someone who's a Muslim or not a Baha'i. So in that sense, all the properties that were taken over were confiscated and taken away from the Baha'is.
And what happens to the deed of those properties and the houses?
It's handed over. I mean, I don't know the exact details of the case that you're talking about. But in the case of the Ivel properties, many of them were handed over to Setad, to Imam Khomeini's order, who then was also encouraged to give them to other villagers in Ivel, for example.
So Setad takes over the houses of Baha'is or the properties of the Baha'is, and
Yes.
then it is the Setad that also gives it to certain individuals. And do those individuals own those properties right now, or it's still owned by the Setad and leased to these individuals?
I don't know the details of the technicalities of how Setad deals then with those properties.
Has the Baha'i community inside Iran or outside of Iran pursued taking back these properties through legal means, according to the Iranian laws or international laws?
Yeah, so there has been the case in Ivel has been basically ongoing for many years, because the Iveli Baha'is have been living there for generations, actually, for over a century. They've been there in the village of Ivel. And so when the confiscation started, really some years after the revolution, it's been an ongoing case of appealing. And they wrote even to the clergy in Ivel and in the province and even nationally. I mean, they've gone through basically any and every legal means that they could, including religious leaders. And unfortunately, the final court order was the one that was issued, that we've asked basically to be revoked through the efforts that we saw, for example, with the campaign "It's Their Land," which happened last year, which actually had a lot of support internationally.
Tell us about the campaign a little bit.
Yes, so this was a campaign. It was a global campaign called for by the Baha'i International Community's UN office, but really took off, and there were groups that we hadn't even necessarily even reached out to. Groups themselves really initiated. For example, there were farmers groups in Australia and in different places, and lawyers and judges in Canada and different countries that really wrote letters to the Iranian government themselves, asking for the government to return the land of these Iveli Baha'is, saying it's their lands and you have to return it to them. And so it really was one of the, one of the campaigns of the past year that really brought the Baha'i community closer to not only the Iranian community, but also globally, and showed really the international community that the Baha'is in Iran are innocent. And there was a documentary some years ago where a Baha'i villager whose properties had been confiscated was being interviewed, and she said, the journalist asked her, why are they taking your property, your home away from you? And she said, they've come and they've broken my windows, and they've said that I'm a spy for Israel, but I don't even know where Israel is on the map. How can I be a spy? And so, even her image really became the image of the campaign.
Yeah. So Munir, could you tell us about if your family has pursued taking back the property through legal channels inside Iran? And also, I want to know about your uncle's business, because as you said, he was an industrialist before his arrest, and he had a brick factory. So what happened to the factory, and have you done anything through Iranian courts in order to take back the properties?
So the factory early on in the revolution was confiscated and done with. It's over. And So I don't even know what's happened to it. Is the factory still running, or did they just fully shut it down? But it hasn't been in the possession of our family and my uncle. Right. That was one of the first things that happened in 79, 80. As far as legal action, I know with the attack in 2013 in Semnan, because my uncle is a part owner of this, and we believe that those attacks were coming from his affiliation in Semnan with our family. So I know that they went through courts in 2 different occasions. And again, everything's at standstill. There's no resolution or no response.
And what has it done to your family on an individual level? Because when we're talking about confiscation of property, it's not only the building that they are taking away from an individual, it's their home, it's their history. And in your case, you were talking about more than 100 years of living in that place. So generations of Khanjanis lived in that place. What did it do to your family individually? What were the emotions after the confiscation?
Uh, I can't imagine just that, my car was broken into when I was, in my mid-20s, and my music was taken, and I felt so violated, and it was just such a horrible feeling. So I can't imagine what I've heard has happened to my family's property, and also what Simin has shared here. Uh, Emotionally, though, because my family really is a strong believer in the Baha'i faith and extremely devoted, they see these as their way of service. So they're very strong. I'm sure they have their frustration, their anger, but they're strong, and they try to bounce back. They try to find another creative way to make a few bucks to support their family. That's what I have seen. I rarely hear them complain or play the victim stance, but they're just so courageous that me being in the States since age 12, I can't even relate to that level of courage and steadfastness.
Yeah.
But they're very creative.
Yeah, I think having worked on the Baha'i issues for the past decade or so, I'm familiar with many stories, and it's just heartbreaking when you think about individuals living peacefully their lives in a place, and they're not even proselytizing, they're not even talking about their faith, and all of a sudden they're kicked out of their houses, they're put in prison, and I think that is real personal tragedy for every Iranian, not only for the Baha'is, because this can happen to anyone. I mean, today it's the Baha'is, next day it can be Zoroastrians, another time different kinds of Muslims, and unfortunately, hundreds of thousands, millions of Iranians, they have experienced this, not only Baha'is, but others as well. So, Simin, tell us about documenting these confiscations and different kind of persecution of Baha'i individuals and the Baha'i community in Iran. Have you been documenting every confiscation, and what are you going to do with those documents?
Yeah, so you may know that in recent years, a website called the Archive of the Persecution of the Baha'is in Iran was launched by the BIC, which essentially archives every single document showing the persecution of the Baha'is since basically and the inception of the Baha'i faith, essentially, with, of course, most of the documents being from after the revolution. And so actually looking through that website, you'll see hundreds and hundreds and thousands of actually documents showing really the extent of the persecution. And for anyone who doubts for a second the reasoning behind the persecution, the court documents that are in this website will show really the true reality of why the persecution.
And what are you doing with those documents in terms of international condemnation of the Iranian government, sanctions, taking back the properties? What is happening with that?
So we send every single incident of persecution, including documentation, to the United Nations, to United Nations Special Rapporteurs, basically on an ongoing basis. And of course, you've seen the campaigns that take place, the media initiatives, and various other things as well. But in terms of the documentation, all of the persecution is documented and sent regularly to different UN mechanisms and special
It is
procedures.
available online. What is the website address?
Archives of the Persecution of the Baha'is in Iran.
.com.
The actual website. I can tell
That's
you
okay.
that.
I will. Yeah, we can talk about. We can show that later. So I'm just wondering about the organizations that are involved, because now that the U.S. government, especially, is talking to the Iranian government about lifting the sanctions, and there are certain organizations that are going to be part of the sanctions because they have been part of the human rights abuses in Iran. So in terms of the organizations that are part of this suppression and confiscation of the Baha'i community and the confiscation of the Baha'i properties, we've talked about Setat and we've talked about Revolutionary Guards. What are the other organizations that are involved in confiscation of properties and persecution of Baha'is in general in Iran?
So I mean, I'm not sure I can name every single one here, but
So
I
many
think,
of them to know. Okay.
yes,
So
there
many
are
to
many
mention.
of them because there's so many. Also, I mean, you know better than anyone that the Iranian system of governance is very complex, and so there are so many different elements involved in every aspect of the persecution. So what we see, what we can say are the trends and the patterns, and which agencies and which bodies at a particular time we see are leading the persecution. And so at the moment, it's ICO or the Setad.
So this complex nature of confiscation and persecution, is it because they want to conceal their responsibility and they want to say that we are not involved in this persecution, or what is the reason, do you think? Or is it because of the nature of the regime?
I think, I think part of it is the nature
Mhm.
of how it's governed. Iran is governed at the moment, the complexity of it, and then I think depending on who's in charge, who's in power, things change as well, and the elements change, and who's responsible also changes. And some years ago, actually, the BIC wrote an open letter to President Rouhani at the time when he was about to take office.
Who's from Sudan, by the way?
There you go. Basically saying, you promised economic prosperity to all. Does that all include the Baha'i community? And we expect that the all include the Baha'i community. And actually, this term of economic apartheid was used in that letter, which, I think there was also a documentary that you guys worked on around this concept of apartheid and really comparing it to apartheid. But yeah, so this term of economic apartheid was used to talk about how, the Iranian government has basically created this isolation and impoverishment of the Baha'i community through the persecution, and asked the president to really change
What was his
things.
answer?
There was no response.
No response. And I know, Simin, that you live in Geneva. You meet Iranian delegation. You don't meet them maybe, but you see them. You see other delegations, and you also go to New York. There is a Baha'i representative at the UN. There's an office there. What is the answer of the Iranian government when they are asked by their counterparts from different countries about the persecution of the Baha'is and confiscation of Baha'i lands? What do they say? What is their response? or justification?
Yeah, so, I've heard firsthand Mr. Larijani say that the Baha'i community is not a religion, that it's, and therefore deserves essentially the persecution.
So he said that they deserve persecution.
He didn't say that deserve, but he said that they are not a religious group. And so, but you see, I think the argument here is that the Baha'i community never asked for the Iranian government to recognize it as a faith or as a religion. I think the argument here is a freedom of religion or belief, that everybody, regardless of their faith or belief, deserves human rights and should have the human rights, and so should enjoy basic human rights, essentially, regardless of their faith. And so, for example, the Baha'i community, the Baha'i faith is not recognized in the Constitution as a faith, and so that is the justification used by, it's every single time that we hear statements by Iranian officials of the UN, they say it is not a recognized faith in the Constitution. And in many of the court documents, for example, with regards to education, if you look at the documents, it says this individual belongs to a faith which is not recognized as a faith under the Iranian Constitution and therefore cannot attend university, which, when you think in terms of human rights framework, it makes no sense. To say that because of one's faith that they shouldn't go to university.
There's a famous Iranian interview with the Iranian representative at the UN in the beginning of the revolution, and he says that their Baha'is are Israeli spies, and there is a direct contact between the Baha'ism and Zionism, and because of that, we are executing some of them and we are confiscating their properties. So what you're saying is that the Iranian government's answer for persecution and of the Baha'i community and the confiscation of Baha'i properties really has not developed, has not changed since 1979. They are infidels, it's devious cults, and therefore it's open season. We can do whatever we want to them, and we can do more, and they should be feeling lucky that we are not doing even more to them. Is that's basic argument of the Iranian government.
That's basically it. And we saw some just recent years, Mr. Zarif, in an interview, he said that there is no Baha'i in prison in Iran, which could be proven wrong very, very easily. And so
I think he said that there's no Baha'i in prison in Iran because
because of their faith.
Baha'i, because of their faith.
Because of their faith, yes. Which could be proven. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly.
But they haven't brought forward any other evidence that they've been spying. Otherwise, we would have seen it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Simin and Munir. Munir, do you have anything else to say? What your personal, your family experience? I think you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself and.
Basically, just on tail end of the conversation that you and Simin were just having, that Baha'is are law-abiding citizens. We are instructed that wherever we live, we need to follow the law of the land. So for that alone, we are, as a Baha'i community, they haven't broken any laws, and they've tried very hard to follow every legal protocol. Again, I'm very humbled and very proud of my family. And again, their strength always gives me strength, because I can't again imagine being, having moved here as a child and grown up in an environment that.
Give our best to your uncle, your aunt, and the rest of your family. And Simin, do you have anything to add at the end?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, what Nadir Monir was just saying. I think, for example, this allegation that Baha'is are spies for Israel, if you look at why this is being said, is because, the prophet of the Baha'i community, Baha'u'llah, is buried in Israel. Why is he buried in Israel? It's because at the time in Iran or Persia at the time, he was exiled, and then he was exiled by the Ottoman Empire for bringing in the faith, and he came to what at the time was Palestine, and a prison city. And so he was just a prisoner here in Israel until basically the end of his life. And so he was buried essentially in Israel. And that's, I mean, the Palestine at the time, which then became Israel. But then it's basically the facts are being misused to say that. And then also just to add to what Monir was saying about the obedience of the Baha'i community, just to say that after the revolution, the Iranian government banned essentially the Baha'i institutions, saying that they were illegal. And in order to show their goodwill, the Baha'i community stopped all Baha'i institutions in order to show their obedience to the government at the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Simin and Monir, for taking part in this webinar. And thank you, everyone, for watching this event live or after it's recorded. You can find more information about what we discussed on IranWire.com. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very, very much for having me.